Hey, John. Tommy Gibbons here, the professor of the course. Great to have you in the class. And it's week one, so I thought I'd send along a video reply to the work that you've submitted in both forums, which is excellent, by the way. And, give you a little bit more of a direct welcome to the course and hopefully get our conversation started on Matthew's Gospel. So I just want to highlight a few things in what you have written in response to both forums. I think, first of all, I I appreciate the way that you have tried to hold certain things in tension in your description of Israel's life. One being that the Gentiles that are sort of concentrated around Israel as they settle in the promised land do constitute a kind of threat to Israel's life. And that deserves description and analysis, but it goes hand in hand with the way that these Gentile peoples sometimes bless Israel. If you think of Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, later Ruth, one of Jesus's mothers, is from Moab. So it's not possible to tell just one story, you might say, of Israel and Gentile peoples. And that becomes crucial, I think, as Israel's life continues to unfold, especially in the Babylonian deportation, where Jewish communities integrate in a variety of ways in Gentile communities who welcome them, host them. Obviously, in some cases, it's very difficult and relationships are hostile, but not always. And so by the time Jesus comes onto the scene, there is really a strong memory and hope of Gentile peoples being a blessing to Israel and Israel being a blessing to them. So that's something that I think is crucial to keep in mind as we try to make sense of what Jesus is doing in Matthew's gospel. You talk about at the end Israel being a sort of vehicle that God prepares to deliver all of the human. And I think that that's right. The one caveat in my mind to that is that we don't want to underplay the way that God's purpose with Israel is also, and maybe even primarily for Israel. It is to bless Israel, to love Israel, to make a home with Israel, to sort of delight in Israel's life and to bless Israel so that it delights in God's presence and God's life. So there's a kind of just enjoyment of God's presence that's also key to who Israel is. And that I think has to be sort of borne in mind alongside the way that this life of blessing and joy and delight is the hope of other peoples. But what that will help us to do is to avoid kind of reducing Israel to just being an instrument for something beyond it, and to recognize that Israel is itself the purpose, the goal, in a variety of ways of God's self disclosure, finally in the Messiah. This is going to maybe help us get at something that we see in Matthew that kind of grates against some of our sensibilities, I think, as Christians today in this sort of part of the world. And that is that Jesus does not undergo any kind of Gentile mission, really, in Matthew. He brings healing and salvation to the house of a Gentile centurion, but that's an officer that is living in Capernaum, the town where Jesus is settled. He has a really difficult encounter with a Canaanite mother in Matthew 15, but generally there just isn't this sort of aggressive push to reach Gentile peoples in Matthew, and even a kind of warning against it. And in light of what I'm trying to draw out here, I think that's actually true to who God is and to Israel's memory and its hope. Jesus doesn't hope to reach Gentile peoples at the expense of Israel. Jesus expects any hope that there is of the Gentiles of the world to depend on God's promises and faithfulness to Israel, and specifically to the small part of Israel that is living in the land of promise. And then even less than that, because not the Samaritan part of Israel, only the Jewish part of Israel is where Jesus concentrates his work in the drama of Matthew's gospel. Why is this important? Well, lots of reasons, but one that I'll mention here is that we can sometimes conceive of our calling as Christians in terms of mission, in terms of serving others, to such an extent that we begin to imagine ourselves or others as mere instruments of God's purpose for others, means to an end different from us. But in fact, it's important to remember that where God's name has come and is being named, where God is present through the Spirit in the name of Jesus, God's purpose is also simply to bless. God delights in that gathering of people and longs for the joy of that gathering of people with one another within each of themselves. And so being able to hold together just the purpose that God has of delight for whoever God reaches, and only through that for us to see that that spills over into blessing also for other people's salvation that finally reaches to the ends of the earth. So that's just one highlight. Another one that I think I was going to mention was you talk about the crowd as an important character in Matthew's gospel. And I thought this was such an astute observation. You're correct, I think, that this is in fact a key term in Matthew. In some ways, it adds this kind of layer of dynamic and even ambiguity to the way that Jesus is relating to his own disciples more directly than he is relating to the crowds often. But the crowds manifest some of the same both difficulties and hopes that the disciples do, and they sort of indicate the indefiniteness, the open-endedness of who Jesus is and what he is doing. While he is concentrated on certain people, there's always a kind of indefinite, open-ended quality to the power of Jesus. And that's why there is always a crowd that is not far from view when Jesus is relating to disciples, people by specific names, that sort of thing. So I thought that was a great observation. You talked in one place too about the hero narratives. I thought that that's one way that you described it. But basically just key people in Israel's past. And I think you noted, yeah, that you say Israel built up their hero narratives based on God's selection, support, and promise for King David. And I think that's right to some extent, but it's probably worth emphasizing that the hero narratives of Israel also kind of complicate what it means to be a hero, because they show these heroic figures to be deeply flawed, to depend on all kinds of gifts and blessings from God that are not necessarily what they have achieved, and are often themselves the betrayers of. And that's true with King David, which we see highlighted even in Matthew mentioning Uriah the Hittite's wife as the one through whom the sort of memory of David comes down to Jesus. So it's not David's like shining moment, it's actually his worst moment that is sort of accentuated in the genealogy. And we could say that about other key figures here as well. And I want to suggest that we will need to say that even about Jesus. Jesus is not straightforwardly a hero. He's not straightforwardly a king. He's also an anti-hero hero. He's an anti-king king, complicating these categories that we have because those categories themselves can be ways in which we fail to see how God works in the world, the nature of God's power and the like. So that's just some food for thought. But again, want to thank you for great work here in week one and looking forward to more conversation with you.